I want you to picture something. A wedding, white roses, candles flickering on every table, 120 people dressed in their finest, laughing, crying, clinking glasses, and me standing at the back of the room in a plain black uniform, holding a tray of champagne flutes, watching my sister marry the man I had met first. That was 3 years ago, and I've never told anyone the full story. Not really, so here it is. I'm 31 years old. I work as a veterinary technician in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. I drive a sensible car. I own 2 houseplants that have somehow survived 5 years with me. I am not, by anyone's definition, remarkable. I've made peace with that, mostly. My sister Brittany is 2 years older than me, and she has always been the sun in our family's solar system. Not because she demanded it, that's what made it impossible to resent. She was just naturally radiant. The kind of person who walks into a room and people turn without knowing why. She had our mother's cheekbones and our father's laugh, and somehow the combination was devastating. I got the sensible part of both of them, brown hair that did what it was told, a face that was pleasant enough, a personality that was easy to overlook. Growing up, I learned to take up less space. Not because anyone told me to, just because there was never quite enough room left after Brittany filled it, and making yourself smaller feels a lot like kindness when you're young and don't know the difference yet. I loved her, though. I want to make sure that's clear. I genuinely, completely loved my sister. I met Daniel Hayes at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. I was 28. He sat at the other end of the table, and somehow we ended up in a conversation that lasted 3 hours, long after everyone else had split into smaller groups. He was funny in a quiet way, the kind of funny that sneaks up on you. He asked real questions and actually listened to the answers. He remembered things I mentioned in passing and brought them back 10 minutes later. We talked about our families, our work, a documentary we'd both seen about deep-sea fish that had terrified and fascinated us in equal measure. I drove home that night with something warm sitting in my chest, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I told my mother I'd met someone interesting. She smiled and said that was nice and asked if I wanted more pasta. 2 weeks later, Brittany met Daniel at a work event, and just like that, he was hers. I watched it happen the way you watch a storm roll in slowly, and then all at once. Instagram posts, then a dinner I wasn't invited to, then a weekend trip. Then she called me to say she'd met someone incredible, and I sat on my kitchen floor and said, "That's wonderful, Britt," and I meant it. And I also felt something quietly breaking, and I tucked that broken thing into a drawer somewhere deep and shut it firmly. I told myself it wasn't serious. It had been one dinner. I'd romanticized a conversation. He was charming and I was lonely, and I had confused a pleasant evening for something it wasn't. I told myself that story for 14 months, all the way through their engagement. When Brittany called to tell me Daniel had proposed, I screamed with her. I told her he was perfect for her, which was the kind of thing I believed with one part of myself and quietly mourned with another. I assumed I would be a bridesmaid. Of course I would. I was her sister. The bridal planning meeting was at my mother's house on a Sunday afternoon. There were 4 of us around the kitchen table. Brittany, my mother, and Brittany's 2 best friends, and I sat across from Brittany with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, listening to her talk about venues and flowers and color palettes, waiting for my name to come. It didn't come. Her bridesmaids were a college roommate named and our cousin from my dad's side. 4 women, all of them chosen out loud, happily, specifically. And then Brittany moved on to centerpieces. I waited until later that evening, when it was just the 2 of us in the kitchen washing dishes. I asked her about it carefully, gently, the way you test ice before you step on it. She turned to me with a look I recognized, the one that meant she had already thought this through and landed on the version of events that cost her the least. She said I always got awkward in social situations. She said she thought I'd be relieved. She said she was actually doing me a favor. And then she told me the catering team needed an extra server for the reception, just for cocktail hour and dinner service. It would save them a bit of money, and I'd still be there for the whole day. Wasn't that better, really? Being useful rather than just standing around looking uncomfortable in a dress that didn't fit quite right. I said yes. Because I always said yes. Because saying yes felt like love, and I hadn't yet learned that love is not the same thing as disappearing. In the weeks between that conversation and the wedding, there were family dinners and venue visits, and an engagement party I attended in a blouse I'd ironed 3 times because I wanted to look nice even though no one was particularly looking. Daniel was at most of these things. And Daniel was quietly, consistently, the only person in any room who seemed to actually see me. He asked about my work, remembered the names of animals I'd mentioned treating weeks earlier, laughed at things I said that other people talked over. Once, at a family dinner, he caught my eye across the table when Brittany interrupted me for the 3rd time in a row, just a small look, barely anything. And I felt seen in a way that was almost painful after so long of being invisible. A week before the wedding, we were at the venue together helping set up some decorations. Brittany had run out for something and my mother had gone with her, and for about 20 minutes it was just Daniel and me untangling strings of fairy lights in a quiet room. He said, not quite looking at me, "I feel like I've been trying to actually talk to you for 2 years, and something always gets in the way." I laughed and said something light and kept untangling the lights. But I felt it, that warm thing in my chest that I thought I'd locked away, pressing quietly against the drawer. The night before the wedding, Daniel called me. He said he was nervous and couldn't sleep and Brittany was at her bachelorette gathering, and he didn't want to call his friends because they'd just give him whiskey and bad advice. We talked for an hour, about nothing important mostly. And then, near the end, he went quiet for a moment and said, "Do you remember that birthday dinner, 2 years ago?" I said I remembered. He said, "I've thought about that night a lot." I said goodnight and hung up and lay in bed staring at the ceiling for a very long time. And for the first time in 2 years, I let myself think the thought I had been refusing to think. What if it wasn't just me? What if he had felt it too that night and made a choice, not cruelly, not consciously, but simply by going in the direction life pointed him, and had been quietly wondering ever since? I didn't sleep much. The morning of the wedding, I put on my black uniform, clipped my hair back, and drove to the venue alone. The estate was beautiful in the early morning light, white roses everywhere, the kind of venue that costs what I make in 4 months. I checked in with the catering manager, a brisk woman named who handed me a tray and a schedule and did not ask my name. I watched my mother arrive in a navy dress she'd bought especially for the day. I watched Brittany's bridesmaids float past in their blush gowns, laughing and taking photos. I watched guests I'd known my whole life walk right past me with their eyes skimming over the server in black the same way you look past furniture. A couple of them recognized me. One of my mother's friends paused and said, "Oh, are you working the wedding?" with a kind smile that was somehow the loneliest thing I'd experienced in months. I said yes. I said I was happy to help out. I said it was a beautiful day, wasn't it? During the ceremony, I stood at the side of the room, tray in hand. I watched Daniel at the altar. He was composed and handsome in his dark suit, and he was scanning the room slowly in that way people do when they're looking for something to anchor themselves to. His eyes moved through the seated guests, past the bridesmaids, past the flowers. And then they found me, standing at the edge of everything in my black uniform. He held my gaze for a moment that was 1 beat too long to mean nothing. Then Brittany appeared at the end of the aisle and he looked at her, and I looked down at my tray and I counted the champagne flutes. 6, all full. I focused on that. I served drinks for 2 hours. I said of course and right away, "And can I get you anything else?" I was efficient and invisible and very, very good at my job. The reception moved inside for dinner. I was circling the room with a wine bottle when I noticed Daniel wasn't at the head table. I told myself it didn't matter. I went to the kitchen to restock, and he was there. Standing in the kitchen of his own wedding reception, alone, with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, and an expression on his face like a man who has been holding his breath underwater for too long and has finally decided to surface. He looked at me and said, "I made a mistake." Just like that. No preamble. No softening. Like the words had been sitting in his throat so long they'd simply fallen out. I set my tray down on the counter. I told him he was overwhelmed, that it was a big night, that he should go back out there. He said, "I should have said something 2 years ago. At that dinner, I think you know that." He paused. "I think you've always known that." The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere through the wall, I could hear music and laughter, and the sound of 120 people celebrating something that had a crack running through the middle of it that only 2 people in the world could see. I wanted to be the good person in the room. I wanted to pick up my tray and walk back out and serve the rest of the dinner and drive home and lock that drawer forever. That would have been the noble thing, the selfless thing, the thing. But I was so tired of being quiet about things that mattered. I said, "Yes, I know." And then I told him something I hadn't planned to say. I told him that whatever he decided to do about that night, about the marriage, about any of it, he could not do it because of me. He had to do it because it was true. Because the one thing I was absolutely sure of, standing there in my black uniform at my sister's wedding, was that I did not want to be anyone's escape route. I had spent enough of my life being convenient. He nodded. He stood there for another moment, and I saw something settle in him, not relief, exactly, but the particular quiet of a person who has finally stopped lying to themselves. He put his jacket back on and went back to the reception. I picked up my tray and followed him out. I don't know exactly what he said to Brittany. I was on the other side of the room when he leaned close and spoke quietly to her, and I watched her face stay very still in the way that faces go still when something enormous is happening beneath the surface. They slipped out together. They came back separately. Brittany danced and smiled and cut the cake, and no one who didn't know her would have seen a single thing. But I knew her. I watched my sister perform the last hours of her wedding with a composure that was the bravest and most heartbreaking thing I'd ever seen, and I felt something for her then that had no simple name. I served champagne until 10 o'clock. I helped the kitchen staff stack the chairs. I turned in my tray to who thanked me by not saying anything at all, and I drove home alone. In the weeks that followed, the story assembled itself the way these stories always do, in pieces. Through phone calls and silences and things my mother said that she immediately regretted saying. Daniel and Brittany separated before the honeymoon ended. And the family, needing somewhere to put the wreckage, put it on me. I became the jealous sister, the plain one who had always wanted what Brittany had, the one who had somehow, no one was quite sure how, poisoned the whole thing. It was a clean story. It required very little evidence and explained everything neatly. I let it sit for a while because fighting it felt like more of myself than I was willing to give. But here is what actually happened. I spent 2 years quietly loving a man I never claimed. I stood at my sister's wedding in a server's uniform because I was too accustomed to saying yes to know how to say anything else. And in a kitchen, on the worst and most honest night of my life, I finally told the truth. And the truth was simply that yes, I had always known. And that knowing it didn't make me a villain. It just made me human. Daniel and I talk now, slowly, carefully, with nothing hidden, which is new for both of us. I don't know what we are yet. I'm not sure that's the point. The point is this. I spent so long serving drinks at other people's celebrations that I forgot I was allowed to have something of my own. I called it being supportive. I called it being a good sister, a good daughter, a good, quiet, unremarkable woman who didn't need much. But somewhere underneath all of that, there was a version of me who had felt something real on an ordinary night at a birthday dinner and had spent 2 years pretending she hadn't. She deserved better than that. So did everyone. I'm 31 years old. I own 2 houseplants and drive a sensible car, and I am still, by most definitions, not particularly remarkable. But I'm done disappearing, and it turns out that's enough to change everything.